On February 24, 1944, amidst the sludge-filled routes south of Cisterna, Italy, troops from the American 1st Armored Division huddled near a colossal wreck to examine a prize of war. Before them lay a 70-ton German Elephant tank destroyer, abandoned by its crew after an engine fire, its massive 200mm frontal plate bearing the scars of American shells that had ricocheted harmlessly off its thick hide. Yet, as the crews inspected this mechanical monster up close, they noticed a peculiar and fatal flaw. Aside from a single forward-facing ball-mounted weapon, the vehicle completely lacked machine guns for defending its flanks, rear, or superstructure against infantry. The tactical implication of this discovery was immediately clear to the soldiers. This seemingly invulnerable machine, capable of shrugging off tank fire and destroying targets 3 kilometers away, was nearly defenseless against a lone man on foot approaching from the side. This physical evidence corroborated intelligence reports from the Eastern Front, confirming that the Ferdinand, later redesignated the Elephant, was a paradox of design, standing as both a marvel of heavy engineering and a catastrophic failure of practical utility that would teach American forces exactly how not to build an armored fighting vehicle. To fully grasp how such a glaring oversight occurred, you must examine the vehicle's unconventional genesis during a 1942 military competition for a new heavy tank intended to dominate European and Russian battlefields. Ferdinand Porsche, a close associate of Adolf Hitler, was so assured of his victory over the competing Henschel design that he preemptively ordered the production of 100 chassis at the Nibelungen factory in St. Valentin, Austria. However, his confidence crumbled during the evaluation trials at Birka in April 1942, where his radical petrol-electric hybrid struggled in deep mud and suffered from chronic mechanical failures. When the reliable Henschel prototype won the contract to become the legendary Tiger I, the German High Command decided to salvage Porsche's massive investment by converting his 91 surplus chassis into heavy tank destroyers. By relocating the engines to the front and bolting a colossal fixed casemate to the rear, engineers created the Panzerjäger Tiger P, officially the SD KFZ-184, but universally known as the Ferdinand. Between March and May of 1943, these converted vehicles emerged, weighing 65 tons each, boasting frontal armor 200mm thick that rendered them impervious to any Allied or Soviet anti-tank weapon in service at the time. The vehicle's offensive power was equally formidable, centered around the 88mm Panzerjägerkanone 43/2 with an L-71 barrel, one of the most lethal anti-tank guns ever mounted on tracks. Capable of penetrating 190 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters, this weapon could annihilate a Soviet T-34 from ranges exceeding 3 kilometers, often striking before the enemy could even distinguish the German destroyer from a distant speck on the horizon. Inside the fighting compartment, the commander and gunners operated within the rear casemate, while the driver and radio operator sat isolated in the hull's nose, connected to their comrades only by a fragile radio link. Despite its fearsome armament, the Ferdinand was crippled by serious mechanical weaknesses, primarily because the twin Maybach HL-120 engines were too underpowered to push the 65-ton mass faster than a crawling 10 kilometers per hour in cross-country conditions. The vehicle was a logistical nightmare, plagued by a temperamental drive system that overheated, rapid track wear due to the cost-saving omission of return rollers, and a pitiful 90-kilometer range. Furthermore, retrieving a disabled unit was a massive undertaking, often requiring multiple Bergpanzer IV recovery vehicles harnessed together to move the dead weight. The entire production run of 91 units was assigned to Schwere Panzerjägerabteilung 653 and 654, forming the Heavy Regiment 656 under the command of Oberst Rudolf Gill. These battalions faced their combat debut in July 1943 during the Battle of Kursk, serving as the vanguard for Operation Citadel, which was Germany's massive and ultimately desperate attempt to envelop and eliminate the Soviet salient surrounding the city. Adolf Hitler delayed the offensive time and again, banking on the arrival of advanced weaponry, like the Panther tank and the Ferdinand, to turn the tide. He was convinced these technological marvels would counterbalance the Soviets' sheer numerical superiority and secure a definitive triumph. For the northern pincer of the assault, 89 Ferdinands were assigned to Field Marshal Walter Model's 9th Army, ready to lead the charge. However, ominous signs appeared before the battle even commenced, as mechanical failures forced the immediate withdrawal of 6 vehicles for repairs, leaving 83 units to spearhead the attack. Operation Citadel officially launched at approximately 0530 hours on July 5, 1943, following the thunderous artillery barrage. As the vanguard of the German advance, the Ferdinands rolled forward with a specific mandate: to eliminate Soviet armor and anti-tank emplacements from long range, clearing a path for lighter units. In those early hours, the destroyers performed exactly as intended, utilizing their formidable cannons to obliterate T-34s long before the Soviet tanks could close the distance to fire back. The Ferdinand's 200 millimeters of frontal armor proved nearly impenetrable, shocking Soviet crews as their shells bounced harmlessly off the German behemoths. While some terrified defenders abandoned their posts rather than face these seemingly invincible monsters, the Soviet defensive network was far more sophisticated than German intelligence had predicted. The Central Front alone had deployed over 400,000 anti-tank mines across multiple belts, creating a lethal hazard for the 65-ton destroyers. The vehicle's immense weight turned minor mine damage into catastrophic mobility kills. A single detonation could shatter the suspension, bend the tracks, or destroy road wheels. Field repairs on such heavy machines were nearly impossible under fire, leading to staggering attrition rates within the first day. Of the 45 Ferdinands from Schwere Panzerjägerabteilung 653 committed to the initial assault, all but 12 were immobilized by mine damage before 1700 hours. Although many vehicles would eventually be recovered, the abandoned giants became prime targets for Soviet demolition teams, operating under the cover of darkness. Furthermore, the infantry quickly exploited the Ferdinand's most fatal design oversight and their total lack of close-quarters defense. With no mounted machine guns and a main cannon that could not depress sufficiently to hit nearby targets, the crews found themselves defenseless once the enemy closed the distance. Soviet tactics evolved rapidly, with soldiers utilizing their tank phobia training to remain in their foxholes and let the German armor roll right over them. Once the Ferdinands bypassed the first line of defense, infantrymen would emerge from the trenches armed with demolition charges, Molotov cocktails, and PTRD-41 anti-tank rifles. While the rifles could not penetrate the thick armor, precision shots to the engine grills, tracks, and vision blocks could blind or immobilize the vehicle effectively. As soon as a Ferdinand ground to a halt, it was swarmed by infantry, who unleashed a barrage of Molotov cocktails and grenades. Burning fuel cascaded over the engine decks, while grenades dropped into ventilation grills filled the fighting compartment with choking smoke and shrapnel. Trapped inside, with no way to drive off or return fire due to their limited vision, the crews faced a grim choice: remain in the burning hull or attempt to flee on foot towards friendly lines, a move that often proved fatal. In their desperation, some crews resorted to absurd and dangerous defensive measures, such as firing personal MG-42 machine guns through the barrel of the main cannon. Others risked their lives by opening hatches to engage attackers with pistols and submachine guns, exposing themselves to lethal enemy fire. Unfortunately, these frantic improvisations rarely succeeded in saving either the vehicle or the men inside. Despite the Ferdinand's impressive kill ratios in long-range engagements, the Battle of Kursk ultimately exposed the vehicle's unsuitability for offensive breakthrough operations. German records indicate that Schwere Panzerjägerabteilung 653 destroyed 320 enemy tanks, while losing only 13 vehicles in direct combat, with total claims exceeding 500. However, these statistics obscure the tactical reality that most losses were inflicted not by enemy armor, but by mines, mechanical breakdowns, and infantry assaults on the heavily fortified lines. By the time Hitler cancelled Operation Citadel on July 12th, roughly 50 Ferdinands remained operational out of the 89 that had started the campaign. The harsh lessons of Kursk forced a comprehensive recall in the fall of 1943, sending all surviving units back to the Nibelungenwerke factory for major modifications. Engineers addressed the critical flaws by installing a ball-mounted MG-34 machine gun for the radio operator, applying Zimmerite anti-magnetic paste, and fitting a new commander's cupola with 7 vision blocks, the same type used on the Stu G3, to drastically improve battlefield situational awareness. The implementation of these modifications added a substantial 5 tons to the vehicle's mass, pushing its total weight to a staggering 70 tons. Since the engineers made no corresponding upgrades to the powertrain, the already underpowered Ferdinand became even more lethargic and difficult to maneuver. Following a direct order from Adolf Hitler on May 1, 1944, the machine was officially redesignated from Ferdinand to Elephant. In February 1944, the German High Command rushed 11 of these newly modified Elephants to the Italian front. The 1st Company of Heavy Tank Destroyer Battalion 653, under the command of Oberleutnant Helmuth Ulricht, was deployed specifically to counter the Allied amphibious landing at Anzio. British and American forces had established a beachhead south of Rome, threatening to outflank the established German defensive lines. However, the rugged Italian landscape proved to be a far more hostile environment than the open Russian steppes. The narrow mountain roads, characterized by steep gradients and sharp hairpin turns, were simply not engineered to accommodate 70-ton behemoths, and civilian bridges crumpled under their immense weight. Consequently, crews were forced to ford streams, climb rocky slopes, and navigate treacherous terrain that would have challenged even significantly lighter tanks. The mechanical toll was immediate and severe. Stressed engines frequently overheated during ascents, while transmissions shattered under the relentless strain. The tracks disintegrated at an alarming rate, a problem compounded by a total lack of replacement parts within the Italian theater. Whenever an elephant succumbed to mechanical failure on a constricted mountain pass, it effectively severed the supply line, blocking the route until it could be laboriously recovered or shoved off the road. American tank crews obtained their first close-up inspection of the behemoth in late May 1944, when vehicle number 102 suffered an engine fire and was abandoned by its crew. American engineers subjected the captured machine to a rigorous examination, confirming intelligence reports that had trickled in from the Eastern Front. Their analysis revealed a paradox. While the vehicle boasted exceptional armor and firepower, it was plagued by critical design flaws. The intelligence assessment highlighted the crew's severely restricted visibility, particularly toward the flanks and rear of the hull. Defensive capabilities were equally lackluster. The single, hull-mounted machine gun covered only a narrow arc directly ahead, leaving the vehicle exposed to infantry attacks. Most damningly, the engineers concluded that the exorbitant weight, paired with an inadequate drivetrain, made the Elephant a liability, prone to breaking down long before it could reach the battlefield. Based on these findings, American tactical doctrine shifted to exploit the tank destroyer's sluggishness, advising commanders to avoid frontal engagements where the Elephant held the advantage. Instead, Allied forces would maneuver to strike the vulnerable flanks and rear, or simply wait for the German vehicles to immobilize themselves mechanically. Once a target was stationary, it became easy prey for artillery barrages, air support, or even standard 75mm tank guns. The operational record in Italy was disastrous. Of the 11 machines initially deployed, only 3 survived to be evacuated in August 1944. The rest were whittled away throughout the spring and summer, with specific units like Ferdinand 114 and 131 lost in early March, and Ferdinand 113 destroyed on May 25th. Multiple vehicles were lost during the heavy fighting around Cisterna in June, with the majority of these casualties attributed to mechanical failures rather than direct enemy fire. The captured vehicle 102, which was identified as having originally served as Ferdinand 633 during the Battle of Kursk, was eventually shipped to the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. There, American engineers conducted comprehensive trials that scientifically validated the vehicle's operational limits. The final report concluded that while the Elephant was formidable in a static defensive role, it was fundamentally impractical for the dynamic conditions of mobile warfare. Meanwhile, the remaining Elephants on the Eastern Front continued to see combat throughout 1944, primarily serving in defensive roles across Ukraine. 2 companies comprising 28 vehicles were deployed to bolster Army Group South near Tarnopol, where they proved effective when utilized in well-prepared ambush positions. However, their numbers were far too few to alter the strategic situation, and constant attrition from combat and breakdowns steadily eroded their strength. By January 1945, a handful of surviving Elephants participated in desperate defensive actions against the Soviet Vistula-Oder offensive. As the Red Army pushed deep into Poland, these final machines fought their last battles south of Berlin in April 1945. By the time the war in Europe concluded, only 2 of these massive tank destroyers remained intact. Today, these 2 survivors stand as museum exhibits on opposite sides of the Atlantic. The Ferdinand, captured by Soviet forces at Kursk in July 1943, is on display at the Kubinka Tank Museum outside Moscow. The Elephant, secured by American troops in Italy, resides at Fort Gregg Adams in Virginia, serving as a testament to the engineering extremes of the war. This leaves us with a fundamental question. How could German engineers design a 65-ton tank destroyer so woefully ill-equipped to defend itself against infantry? The answer lies in the vehicle's improvised origins and the rigid assumptions embedded in German military doctrine. The Ferdinand was never conceptualized as a standalone weapon. It was designed to function strictly as part of a combined arms team. In theory, supporting infantry was supposed to screen the vehicle from enemy soldiers, allowing the tank destroyer to focus its long-range firepower on opposing armor. While this logic held up on paper, the chaotic reality of the battlefield often separated the slow-moving armor from its foot soldiers. Mined terrain, fortified positions, or poor visibility frequently pinned down the infantry, leaving the Ferdinand to advance alone and defenseless. A scenario that played out with fatal regularity at Kursk. Ultimately, the failure stemmed from the designers' overconfidence in their philosophy of maximum armor and maximum firepower. They assumed that superior tactics would compensate for mechanical and defensive deficiencies, believing that thick plating and a high-velocity gun rendered close-range threats irrelevant. They failed to account for the harsh lesson that combat had already taught, that an isolated, immobile tank is vulnerable, no matter how thick its steel skin. The omission of adequate machine gun armament on the Ferdinand was not a mere oversight, but rather a deliberate engineering decision rooted in a specific, albeit flawed, tactical philosophy. Designers proceeded under the assumption that this vehicle would function exclusively in a long-range anti-tank role, engaging targets from fortified positions while protected by a screen of friendly infantry. However, this reliance on ideal scenarios proved to be a fatal miscalculation when the chaotic reality of actual combat failed to align with their rigid theoretical models. While the Ferdinand could be devastatingly effective within that narrow operational window, the unpredictability of war seldom grants such perfect conditions. For American engineers, the Elephant served as a critical case study in what to avoid, proving that impressive paper specifications do not automatically guarantee battlefield utility. They understood that possessing the thickest armor or the largest gun is meaningless if the vehicle cannot be maintained, fails to reach the front lines, or lacks the versatility to defend itself against a spectrum of threats. In sharp contrast, United States military doctrine prioritized an entirely different set of operational values, favoring mobility and reliability over static defense. Vehicles like the M10 and M36 carried significantly lighter armor than their German counterpart, but were faster, mechanically simpler, and equipped with multiple machine guns for self-protection. This approach accepted that a tank destroyer's survival depended on its ability to maneuver and remain concealed, rather than relying on the sheer thickness of its steel plating. This created a stark strategic divergence. Germany constructed the ultimate defensive platform, only to discover that defensive power is useless if the machine cannot survive the approach to its position. Conversely, the Americans fielded vehicles that were less imposing on a technical datasheet, but far more practical in the mud and confusion of actual operations. The history of the Ferdinand ultimately highlights the severe risks inherent in over-specializing military hardware. When the battlefield situation perfectly matched the Ferdinand's design parameters, the vehicle was indeed a juggernaut. Yet, the moment circumstances shifted, its vulnerabilities turned catastrophic. Simple minefields left it stranded, persistent mechanical failures removed it from the fight, and unprotected flanks made it easy prey for infantry assaults. Despite consuming a vast amount of scarce industrial resources, its actual contribution to the war effort remained disproportionately low compared to the cost. Contemporary military historians and analysts now cite the Ferdinand as a textbook example of the conflict between theoretical perfection and practical utility. It is frequently referenced in armor development curricula to illustrate how dazzling technical statistics can mask fatal operational flaws. The enduring lesson is that weaponry must be engineered to withstand the harsh, unpredictable realities of war, rather than being tailored for sterilized scenarios that rarely materialize. The two surviving examples of the Ferdinand stand today as monuments to both the ambition of German engineering and the limitations of hyper-specialized design. When you visit a museum and look past the massive main gun and the impenetrable frontal armor, you eventually notice the solitary machine gun with its restricted firing arc. It becomes immediately clear how this seemingly invincible machine, the premier tank destroyer of 1943, could be rendered helpless by the most basic of threats: a single soldier on foot, armed with a hand grenade. During the summer of 1943, Soviet troops on the Kursk salient quickly recognized this lack of close defense weaponry and exploited it without mercy. Infantry units devised specific tactics to isolate these 65-ton behemoths, fully aware that if they could close the distance, they could destroy the steel fortress using weapons as primitive as a bottle of gasoline and a burning rag. By the time American crews encountered the Elephant in the Italian mountains in the spring of 1944, their fear was significantly tempered by knowledge of its weaknesses. Aware of its mechanical fragility and lack of defensive fire, they learned to bypass the deadly frontal zone. Instead, they would maneuver to strike from the flanks, or simply wait for the vehicle's inevitable mechanical breakdown. The legacy of the Ferdinand proves that victory in modern warfare is not achieved by fielding the most powerful singular asset, but by deploying practical systems that soldiers can use effectively under fire. This tank destroyer, which could barely defend itself against foot soldiers, epitomized a defective design philosophy that influenced armored vehicle development for decades to come. Ultimately, Ferdinand Porsche's repurposed chassis remains one of the most controversial machines of the Second World War. Although it achieved staggering kill ratios in ideal setups and terrified opponents with its frontal invulnerability, the cost in resources and its susceptibility to low-tech threats negated these advantages. It stands as enduring evidence that practical functionality outweighs raw specifications, and that the most technologically advanced weapon is not necessarily the most effective one.